Welcome back. So we're going to continue with our discussion of culture, and I'm going to start with belief systems, and within that, I'm going to focus on two things. First, I'm going to talk about pessimism, and then I'm going to talk about religion. Okay? Now, you know the concept of expected utility, right? So if utility is stochastic, we take an expectation of different utility outcomes, right? So suppose that with probability P, you have utility 1, and with probability 1 minus P, you have probability U2. So here, obviously, P is between 0 and 1 because it is a probability, right? So now if you are fully raised, so suppose that the act you're going to perform affects your expected utility, and suppose that this is your action, right? So you choose some action to maximize your expected utility, all right? So that could be innovation, that could be education, that could be some other form of action that leads to stochastic outcomes, all right? Now, more specifically, let me write this in this way, right? So suppose that probability is fixed, but if you take some action, U1 will be depending on A, and U2 will also depend on A, right? So you're going to take some action, then you're going to wait for the realization of the actual outcome, right? But you have to take your decision of A without knowing whether it will be U1 or U2. For this reason, you take this expected utility. Now, of course, there are many paradoxes and many counterfactual results obtained when we use expected utility. For this reason, behavioral economists actually developed new theories, right? But it is still a useful framework to discuss certain issues. And here I am doing so for the concept of optimism versus pessimism, right? So suppose that you are a pessimist, right? So suppose that this is what a fully rational agent can do or will do, right? But if you are a pessimist, suppose that this is now success, okay? So PS is success. Now, if you are a pessimist, so this is rational and this is pessimist agent, all right? So if you're a pessimist, you attach less value to success outcome, right? And more value to the failure outcome. Okay, so in general, if you're a pessimistic person, all right, suppose that C is greater than lambda, all right? So these are all positive, but C is greater than, sorry, exactly the reverse. So lambda is larger than C, and it is larger than 0. So here the pessimist agent attaches a larger weight to the failure outcome, right? So then that number is smaller than PS, okay? And that number is smaller than 1 minus PS, so especially when we limit that within, so if this is like this, right? So what happens? The fully rational agent takes a decision, right? and that decision will be different than the pessimistic agent's decision. Okay, so the belief system, the way you you judge objective probabilities about the events that affect your utility or that affect your payoffs, your action changes, all right, depending on your belief system. So that's one example how culture affects growth. And why is that important for long run growth? Because some of the decisions we take in a market society, in a market economy, directly involved with are directly involved with the long run growth of the economy, right? Such as education, capital accumulation, technological progress, and so on and so forth. So all of these sources of growth that we studied, or at least many of them, are subject to stochastic elements, right? So first you have to make the investment, whether it is human capital or technology or capital accumulation. So you have to first take your decision in terms of take your investment decisions, and then you wait for the outcome. And if you are pessimistic, then, for instance, in terms of technology, if you are a pessimistic entrepreneur, then you might find it optimal to spend less than fully rational amount on research. Okay, and that would affect the outcome. So that is one thing. The other thing I want to show you is the effect of religion. So in recent years, especially to understand long-run economic differences between Catholic nations and Protestant nations, economists started revisiting Max Weber. You must know this name, right? So he was the sociologist slash economist who put forth the idea that the Protestant ethic of, hardworking, saving, and attaching more values to the real life without renouncing, religion, was actually beneficial for the long-run growth through education, through technology. So industrialization or economic modernity in that sense, according to Weber, is associated with the rise of Protestant values and the diffusion of these values in Europe. And recent years, many economists actually compiled several data sources for the European countries for the period before and after industrialization, and around the Industrial Revolution, and they most of the time actually confirmed that Weber might actually be right. Now, how can religion affect economic outcomes, especially long-run growth? Well, we might imagine, we might look at this nice model by Holger Strulik. So this is a technical paper, so you may not get all the messages he has, but I'm going to summarize the main argument here. So here in this paper, we are looking at agents that are religious versus secular. Okay. So how do we model that? Well, each agent, so let's first define the set of agents. Okay. So the set of agents is defined in this way. So there's this large population, right? Everybody is indexed by by this index variable I. So everyone has some utility function, okay? And that utility actually changes in time as well, okay? Now, utility you obtain depends whether you are a secular or a religious person. All right. So sigma ti being equal to 1 means you're a secular person, and that being equal to 0 means you are a religious person. Okay. And we write utility. I'm not going to go into exact details, but it depends on my young age consumption. It depends on my old age consumption. Okay. So T means young age, and T plus means old age, right? And it depends on our labor supply as well, right? Because in the young age, we work. So how much leisure time we have is good for our utility. And also it depends what is the benefit of being religious. Okay. Now this part of the model allows us to understand how can people choose their consumption levels, their saving, their labor supply, and so on and so forth. For instance, at the end, I'm not going to again go into the mathematical details, but at the end, we find something like this. So consumption, saving, okay, this is saving of generation T agent, and that will be larger for secular people, okay? And labor supply will also be larger for secular people, okay? So at the individual level, people who have people who obtain lower levels of utility being religious, okay, they choose to become secular, okay, and when they adopt secular values in life, they save more, okay, and they work more, exactly as predicted by the Weberian theory. All right. So again, I'm not going to go into all the details, but as long as we put the status of being religious versus secular, an important parameter in the utility function, an important determinant of utility, then people, of course, if they're rational, they're going to take into account whether they will obtain some utility from being religious or being secular. Now, I'm not saying that this decision is taken in a completely free society, in an ideally, free society where everyone takes fully rational decisions and they are free to choose their religion and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that. Instead, there is, of course, some cultural persistence here, right? So if I am agent I, my kids becoming a particularly religious or secular person depends on whether or not I am being secular or religious, right? Because that is part of the culture. That is one example why culture persists, right? Because when you are exposed to certain values and not exposed to certain others as a result, right? Then your socialization, your value system, your belief system, your religion, your understanding of crucial issues concerning your life and your welfare and your utility, to be more specific, depends on what are the values you are exposed with? Okay, so I'm not saying, as in the case of Strelick, that is all very simple. There's no person or not. In fact, there is such persistence, and this can be even enlarged to have not just parents, but the average situation in the society and some other determinants as well. Okay, for instance, if the constitution in the country is secular or not, right? Then, as you see, culture starts interacting with institutions, right? And culture also in that particular sense. So think about Protestant revolution. So the diffusion of Protestant ethic to certain parts of Europe was easier, perhaps, because there are roads and networks and better institutions in certain countries and certain towns, and not and they're not existing in certain other parts of Europe, or there are mountains that that makes it difficult to transmit that type of culture from one country to the next or one town to the next. All right, or in one town, there is already a highly oppressive regime that is not very tolerant with, you know, heretic ideas, or the local church here is rather powerful, so that the Protestant principles are were facing very harsh punishment, and so on and so forth, right? So there is this huge and very complex uh, interaction between culture and institutions, and this is just one type of argument that how you make it operative in theory, right? So as economists, or as neoclassical economists, uh, we are using the utility maximization framework or welfare maximization framework for many purposes, and culture is just one of them. If we associate a certain element in culture with, you know, directly with the exercise of utility maximization, then we obtain some lessons. Some of these lessons are very intuitive. Some of them could be counterfactual. Then you can, of course, revise your theory by revising your assumptions. So this is all I'm going to discuss for belief systems. So one is the pessimistic versus optimistic or rational beliefs. The other is the effect of being religious versus secular on certain economic outcomes, such as saving and labor supply and other stuff. So even in terms of technology, you can actually do something similar. Now, the next thing I'm going to discuss is the values. Okay, so this is not entirely independent of the belief systems, but here we are thinking more specifically about things such as trust or cooperation, or being tolerant, and so on and so forth. All right, being tolerant to new ideas, or new or let's say foreign people, and so on and so forth, right? So why trust matters? So when I say trust, obviously, I mean a large set of issues. So one is the trust between two persons, right? So you may imagine now the society. So two persons can have some degree of interpersonal trust, or we can imagine the society as this network of agents, right? So each dot here is a network, and some agents trust to each other, and some agents do not trust anyone, and no one trusts that agent. So there's, of course, a complex network. Now, that network could be much more complex if you imagine things such as, so suppose that network is like this, okay, in a society. So agents could be connected through trust within clusters, okay, and across clusters as well. But some agents can remain isolated, okay? So suppose that these agents are completely isolated because they are not connected to the trust network in the society. So if you are a mafia leader, maybe you can trust your other mafia leaders, but not trust to other persons in the society, and other persons, if they know that you're a member of mafia, may not trust you. So the trust also extends to trust between an agent and an institution, okay, or the state or the religion. So there are many types of institutions there, but that is also important, right? So now we should ask why trust is generally very important for economic outcomes. What do you think? Let's hear from you. Why do you think trust is important? Are you there? Hello.
Buradayız hocam.
Buradasınız. So why do you think trust, so described as I just did, why do you think it is an important determinant of certain economic outcomes? Okay, I take your silence as civil unrest movement, and I'm going to continue. So it is generally important because in real life we play games, right? So the simplest game you may imagine is the game of prisoner's dilemma, right? So there are two prisoners, two agents, right? Agent 1, agent 2. So they play this game and they can cooperate, right? Or they can defect. Now, cooperation, of course, is beneficial for both of them, right? Because they remain silent, so they do not give sufficient information concerning the crime to the police. So the police cannot find enough evidence to actually prosecute them. But if one of them defects, the situation is bad for both of them, right? Because if one of the prisoners confesses, then it's not good for neither of them. So in the prisoner's dilemma game, this is just, of course, a metaphor, right? So in the real economic life, we take certain decisions where cooperation and defection are important. So, for instance, we work in teams, right? So we go to school, and our actions are strategically complementary to the agents, to other students in our class. So it is important to understand the cooperation between workers and the managers, and so on and so forth. Cooperation is important for stability of the legal system, the peace in the society, and there are other countless domains where this idea matters. And how do we sustain cooperation in repeated prisoner's dilemma games? So it is not like the games we play are only one-shot games, right? So typically in economic life, we enter strategic situations where we play a game for many times repeatedly, right? So in that game, it is important to realize that cooperation. So there are of course different types of strategies. Maybe you learned some of these in game theory. So there is a strategy that is called tit for tat. There is, um, other types of uh, threat, other types of threatening your opponent. So you may uh, you may sustain your cooperation. But in all of these, one of the most important determinants was how patient you are. And if you are sufficiently patient, you cooperate, right? Now, how can you create that type of cooperation, even if you are not patient, even if you are not uh, looking, even if you are not sufficiently forward-looking? Well, one thing is trust, right? Suppose that, again, in terms of, think about in terms of prisoners, right? So if the two prisoners, if the two members of the mafia, if you are really have a large level of trust against each other, right? Then it is highly probable that uh, you trust your fellow prisoner to not to defect, not to confess to crime, and the same expectation of your being cooperating is also sustained by your opponent, right? So then, prisoners, if they trust each other sufficiently strongly, then there is then it is easier to sustain cooperation in such a game. Okay, and this is exactly what we see uh, in the case of repeated prisoner's dilemma type of games, right? And again, in the real world, in many economic circumstances, we play such games. Um, and there is, of course, one other side, right? So now, if we take trust as an important determinant, now we also understand that trust can change, right? So trust becomes like a stock variable, right? So we play this game repeatedly, and suppose that at time t, uh, suppose that we play this game for many episodes, right? And suppose that in the first we cooperate, in the second we cooperate, in the third we cooperate, in the fourth we cooperate. So that goes on. And when we do that, trust, of course, increases, right? Because we cooperate. So first we trust our opponent. The opponent trusts us. We play cooperation. We see the result of uh, trusting and having been trusted. So that accumulates trust as a useful public good for these two agents, right? But suppose that, so it is cooperation, 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 cooperation. But suppose that at time 7, player 1 cooperates, but player 2 defects. Now, what happens to the trust? Obviously, trust collapses, right? Trust depreciates, because now player 1 is no longer trusting to player 2 because player 2 defected. Okay? So this is how trust is important for economic outcomes, because in many domains in economic life, including, for instance, technology, right? So uh, so think of technology as depending centrally on what we know about nature, right? As in the Moyker's theory of useful knowledge. So we know something about the nature, and different agents in the society know different things about nature. So if these people trust themselves, okay, if there is this idea of, if there is this culture of uh, knowledge sharing, right? Trusting to one another in terms of sharing useful information, then that will be beneficial for technology, because perhaps I'm lacking some type of useful knowledge that I would have, that I would need to invent the steam engine. Okay, so some other agent in the society is there, so they have the knowledge of steam and the entire Newtonian physics and other stuff about chemistry. Then if he or she would be open enough, trusting enough to share that knowledge for the benefit of the society, then I can actually benefit from this, and we can create the steam engine together, and then we can serve the society and the world. All right. So, so it is important in technology, important in human capital accumulation. And if you are trusting the state, right now, there's also this connection with the institutions, right? De facto institutions and de jure institutions. So suppose that the property rights are protected by the constitution of the country and by the by the uh, by the legal system in general, right? So you still need to have a sufficiently strong level of trust of the legal system, trust to the legal system, so that you invest uh, in economic domain, you establish a new firm, you invest in technology, and you kind of uh, you have to you have to have some uh, probability of the outcome, right? So you have to convince yourself that, sufficiently strongly convince yourself that the state will protect your property rights so that you invest. So here again, de jure and de facto political power makes an important distinction, because even if de jure political power is very strong in terms of, you know, protection of the legal, the protection of property rights, the de facto situation may be totally different, and then the trust between the institutions and the agents becomes an important issue. Um, so one last example about uh, values I'm going to discuss is the case of enlightened monarchs in Europe. Okay, so in Europe, as you know, prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was this social, economic, and political system called feudalism, and in that society, there are small fiefdoms, right? So each depending on, so each unit of power, whether it is economic power or political power, depends on some more powerful unit in the society, right? So usually there is this king. The king gives certain privileges to lords, and uh, certain landowners. So it also gives land to these people. So these lords or the nobility, they also have their military power, and the economic situation is like they're peasants, and they work for the lords. In times of war, they work as soldiers, and so on and so forth, right? So there's this. So the important part here is that there's fragmented power, right? So the political power is fragmented. So if you compare this, for instance, uh, centrally powerful states such as Chinese Empire or Ottoman Empire, the situation is totally different. Now, how can we? I mean, why? Uh, so what happened to innovators or heretics in such a society, right? So especially think of the geography as well, right? Because European towns are small towns, and most of them are close to one another, right? Even in pre-industrial times, you can leave one town and arrive at the next town in one day or a couple of hours. So how do we understand that? How do we use that type of historical information for technology and knowledge? So what we observed actually, that since there is a fragmentation of political power in Europe prior to the Industrial Revolution, innovators or heretics or natural philosophers were actually, I mean, had some had faced low pressure, okay, and in certain states in Europe, the monarchs were actually tolerant, okay, against new ideas. Now, is it only about the political fragmentation? No, there's also about the competition in terms of military technology, right? At least after 16th century, states realized that knowledge is important for military power, and this is even more so after the 17th century. So that was another thing where being tolerant to new ideas and new technologies or new forms of knowledge more generally have some important technological or economic effects. Okay, there are many other examples. So for this enlightened monarchs, I would recommend you to check Joel Moyker's texts. So you may find very useful stuff there. Let me pause once again here, and let's meet at I don't know 2:45. The time is now 2:30. So let's meet at 2:45 to finalize our semester. Okay.
Okay.
All right.